For all the talk about globalization, diversification, and energy transition, the modern world is still more fragile than it likes to admit. People often imagine that a system as large as the global economy must be deeply distributed and hard to disrupt. They assume that trade, energy, and logistics are spread across so many routes and suppliers that no single location could hold too much influence over everyone else. But that assumption breaks down the moment you look at one narrow waterway between Iran and Oman. That waterway is the Strait of Hormuz. It may look small on a map, but its importance is enormous. Reuters reported that the strait remained a key artery for around 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas supply. And that tanker traffic there came to a near standstill after the current conflict escalated. Hundreds of vessels were left outside the strait, unable to reach ports, which is a reminder that the global economy can still be held up by a single choke point. That is why the world still depends on one narrow strait. The issue is not just geography, it is concentration. The world has built an enormous amount of energy trade around the assumption that Hormuz will stay open, insurable, and usable. Once that assumption weakens, the damage spreads far beyond the goal. Oil prices rise, gas shipments are delayed, tankers wait, insurance costs climb, importers panic, investors reprice risk. What begins as a regional military threat quickly becomes a global economic question. Reuters reported that the current war has already sent shockwaves through global business, with trade routes, air quarters, and industrial activity all affected. This is the hidden logic of modern dependence. The world does not need Hormuz because it is large. It needs Hormuz because too much irreplaceable movement still passes through it. A narrow route becomes globally powerful when the water system cannot easily substitute what flows across it. That is exactly what makes this strait so dangerous. The first reason the world still depends on one narrow strait is energy. Modern economies do not simply consume oil and gas. They are built around stable access to them. Oil powers freight, aviation, shipping, refining, manufacturing, petrochemicals, and much of the infrastructure of daily life. Natural gas supports electricity generation, industrial production, heating, and heavy business activity across Asia and Europe. When a route carrying so much of that fuel becomes unstable, the consequences are never local for long. Reuters reported that the Iran war has already caused a prolonged hit to global energy markets, with around 1/5 of global crude oil and natural gas supply suspended or disrupted because of shipping threats and attacks on regional energy infrastructure. Oil prices jumped 24% in 1 week and rose above $90 per barrel, while major producers such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and Kuwait were affected by the crisis. That matters because energy shocks multiply. If crude rises, transport costs rise. If transport costs rise, imported goods become more expensive. If LNG supply is disrupted, countries that depend on Gulf cargoes start competing harder for whatever is left. Reuters reported that Qatar halted LNG production and declared force majeure on shipments, while all 10 of the tankers it was offering for lease remained stationed outside Hormuz because of safety risks. Reuters also reported that Qatar supplies around 20% of global LNG, and that replacing those cargoes quickly is extremely difficult. That is why dependence on Hormuz is not just an oil story. It is an energy system story. The strait ties together crude exports, LNG shipping, refinery inputs, freight markets, and inflation expectations. A disruption there does not merely reduce supply. It forces the entire market to ask how much fuel can still move, how quickly it can move, and how expensive that movement is about to become. The second reason the world still depends on one narrow strait is shipping. Globalization looks resilient from a distance because goods are always moving. Ships cross oceans, cargo reaches ports, and supply chains give the impression of constant flexibility. But much of that apparent flexibility rests on a small number of routes remaining open, safe, and affordable. Once one of those routes becomes dangerous, the system does not fail all at once, but it begins to jam. Hormuz is one of the clearest examples of that risk. Reuters reported that maritime insurance premiums surged as the conflict widened, and in some cases insurers canceled war risk cover, which pushed tanker costs sharply higher. Even when vessels are technically able to sail, shipping slows if insurance becomes too expensive, if underwriters reduce coverage, or if owners decide the risk is too high. That means physical closure is not even necessary for business damage to begin. The price of uncertainty can do much of the work by itself. This is why the world still depends on the strait, even beyond energy. Hormuz is also a confidence quarter. Shipping firms, insurers, traders, refiners, and importers all need to believe that passage remains possible. Once that belief weakens, freight costs jump, delays increase, and companies start changing behavior. Reuters reported that global oil and gas shipping costs surged as the war disrupted shipping and production. While LNG freight rates climbed to multi-year highs after cut or halted output. That matters because trade does not rely only on movement. It relies on predictable movement. Once routes stop feeling reliable, corporate planning becomes more defensive. Importers hedge more aggressively. Energy buyers look for replacement cargoes. Investors reprice exposure. What seems like a narrow regional transport issue begins to spread through the wider system of trade and finance. The third reason the world still depends on one narrow strait is timing. If this kind of disruption happened in a calm and confident global economy, the system might absorb it more easily. But that is not the world we have. Supply chains have already been strained by repeated shock. Inflation remains politically sensitive. Businesses are already cautious. Governments are already alert to another energy spike. That means Hormuz is not hitting a fresh system. It is hitting a tired one. That makes the choke point even more dangerous. Reuters reported that the conflict has already become a broader global business shock, affecting not only energy and shipping, but also industrial output, aviation, and technology infrastructure. Economists warn that if the conflict continues, the impact could extend well beyond the region and potentially contribute to a wider slowdown or recession. This is the deeper lesson. For years, many people assumed globalization had reduced the importance of geography. In reality, globalization increased the importance of a few strategic pieces of geography by concentrating more dependence into fewer efficient routes. The more optimized the world became, the more dangerous its bottlenecks became. Hormuz is the clearest proof of that logic. It is not dangerous because it is wide. It is dangerous because it is narrow, and because so much of the modern world still has no easy way around it. That is why the world still depends on one narrow strait. Not because it wants to, but because it built too much of the energy and shipping system around it. Reuters reporting over the last several days has shown the chain clearly. Tanker traffic stalled. Oil and gas flows were disrupted. Insurance premiums surged. LNG supply was halted. Freight costs soared. Markets reacted, Those are not isolated headlines. Together, they describe a world that still depends on one vulnerable quarter more than it would like to admit. History teaches the same lesson again and again. The most dangerous places in the world are not always the largest countries or the biggest battlefields. They are often the narrow passages that carry systems everyone depends on. That is exactly what Hormuz is. If you want to understand where the next major global shock could come from, do not just watch the missiles. Watch the routes, the tankers, the insurers, the LNG cargoes, and the bottlenecks that hold the global economy together, because that is where the real story begins. And if this is the kind of breakdown you want, not just what happened, but why it matters and how it fits into the larger logic of power, trade, war, and global systems, then stay with this channel. We are not just following events, we are mapping the forces underneath them.